You're sitting across from someone, you have the better argument. The facts are on your side. You lay it all out, clearly, logically, respectfully, and they don't budge. In fact, the harder you push, the more they dig in. You walk away frustrated, convinced they're just stubborn. But here's what actually happened. The moment you tried to change their mind, you triggered something ancient and automatic. A wall that goes up the instant a human being feels their sense of self is under threat. And the cruel irony is this: the smarter your argument, the stronger that wall becomes. There is a way past it, but it requires you to abandon almost everything you think you know about influence and persuasion. And it starts with a law most people will never learn. Welcome back. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through 6 laws of human nature that expose the invisible forces running beneath every interaction you have with your boss, your partner, your friends, even yourself. These aren't theories, they're patterns. Patterns that show up in the behavior of presidents and prisoners, artists and conmen, your coworker who can't take criticism, and the friend who always seems to sabotage the good things in their life. Here's what we're going to uncover: why the most powerful people in history gained influence by doing the opposite of what you'd expect. Why your attitude, not your talent, not your luck, is the single greatest force shaping your reality. Why every one of us is walking around with a hidden self that's been locked away since childhood, leaking out in ways we can't see. Why the people closest to you may be quietly working against you and smiling while they do it. Why success is the most dangerous drug a human being can consume. And why the roles you were taught to play may be the very thing keeping you from becoming who you actually are. 6 laws, 6 forces, all of them operating inside you right now. And once you understand them, you will never look at yourself or anyone else the same way again. Let's begin. Law 7. The law of defensiveness. Have you ever wondered how some people seem to control others without them even realizing it? Some of the darkest psychological tricks are based on subtle manipulation, where the victim doesn't even know they are being influenced. There's a reason those people are so effective, and it has nothing to do with cleverness or charisma. It has everything to do with a law of human nature that most people violate every single day without realizing it. Here it is, and it's deceptively simple. Every person you meet carries inside them something we can call a self-opinion. It's the story they tell themselves about who they are, and it almost always contains 3 beliefs. First, I am acting of my own free will. Second, I am intelligent in my own way. And third, I am a good and decent person. Now here's the critical part. It doesn't matter whether these beliefs are accurate. What matters is that they feel true to the person holding them. And when you challenge any of those 3 beliefs, even accidentally, even with the best of intentions, you don't change their mind, you trigger a war. To understand what this looks like when someone gets it right, completely, masterfully, almost terrifyingly right, we need to go to Washington, D.C., December 1948. A young man named Lyndon Baines Johnson has just been elected to the United States Senate. He's 40 years old. He's ambitious in a way that makes other politicians uncomfortable. And he has a problem. Johnson had spent 12 years in the House of Representatives, and his career had stalled. The House was enormous, chaotic, impossible to navigate through personal relationships alone. Johnson was not a great public speaker. He was not particularly polished. What he was, and this is important, was extraordinary one-on-one. In a private conversation, Lyndon Johnson could read you like a book. He could sense what you needed to hear before you knew it yourself. But in a building with 435 members, that skill was almost useless. The Senate was different. Only 96 members. It operated like a private club. And on the day Johnson first walked through the Senate chamber, he had what he later described as an epiphany. This was a place where his particular gift could become the most powerful weapon in American politics. But first, he had to fix something because Johnson's reputation had arrived before he did. One of the first people he visited was Senator Tom Connally of Texas, a senior figure, 31 years older, a man who controlled seats on the most prestigious committees. Johnson walked into Connally's office, exchanged a few pleasantries, and then revealed what he was really after. He wanted a seat on appropriations, finance, or foreign relations, the most coveted committees in the Senate, the kind of positions that took other senators 12 to 20 years to earn. Connally couldn't believe the audacity. He smiled at Johnson, and with the practiced cruelty of a man who had been in the Senate for decades, he offered Johnson a seat on the Agriculture Committee, one of the least desirable assignments in the entire institution. And then he twisted the knife. He told Johnson he'd heard him say many times during the campaign that he was a friend of the farmer. Well, here was his chance to prove it. Johnson squirmed. He couldn't hide his displeasure. And within days, word had spread through the Senate. The new senator from Texas was a hothead, someone to keep an eye on. And then something remarkable happened. When Johnson was officially inaugurated and his colleagues met him for the first time, they encountered a completely different man than the one they'd been warned about. He was polite, deferential, almost humble. He would visit senior senators in their offices, sit patiently in the outer room, sometimes for an hour, waiting to be called in. Once inside, he wouldn't pitch or argue or sell anything. He would ask questions about their families, their home states, their opinions on some bill or bit of procedure. And then he would listen, not the way most people listen, half present, already composing what they're going to say next. Johnson listened with his entire body. His large brown eyes would lock onto the speaker's face. His chin would rest on his hand. He'd nod slowly, and every now and then, just often enough to prove he was truly absorbing every word, he would ask a follow-up question that showed he hadn't just heard what was said, but had understood it. The senators started to notice something else. When Johnson repeated their advice to someone, he would credit them by name. He treated their offhand observations like profound wisdom. He attended every single Senate session, took copious notes on procedure, and seemed genuinely fascinated by the driest bureaucratic details. In the hallways, he always had a good joke ready. His language had the rough humor of the Texan farmer, and the older senators found it charming. So what was Johnson actually doing? He was running one of the most sophisticated influence campaigns in political history. And the foundation of the entire operation was a single principle: confirm the self-opinion. Think about what those older senators valued most: their wisdom, their experience, their sense that they had earned their place through decades of hard work. Johnson didn't challenge any of that. He fed it. He made them feel like the most important people in the room, because to Johnson, in that moment they were. He wasn't faking interest. He was genuinely absorbing everything they said, building a map of the Senate's inner workings that no other politician possessed. His most important target was Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, one of the most powerful men in the institution. Russell was a bachelor. He was lonely. He spent almost every evening in his office, even on weekends. And here was Johnson, visiting him nearly every day, calling him the old master, asking for his guidance on arcane Senate rules. When Johnson discovered Russell loved baseball, he quickly developed an interest in the sport. When he learned Russell was fascinated by the Civil War, suddenly Johnson was fascinated too. He mirrored Russell's values, his work ethic, his conservative Southern sensibilities, and then came the human touch. Johnson started inviting Russell to dinner at his home. His wife, Lady Bird, was a wonderful cook, especially Southern dishes. Russell resisted at first, but eventually gave in. Within months, he was a regular at the Johnson table. The two men were inseparable. Russell began calling Johnson the only junior senator he'd ever considered a true disciple. Johnson never asked Russell for a single favor directly. That's the key. Instead, he did favors for Russell, helping him modernize his staff, giving him access to his own legal and public relations teams. And when Johnson finally wanted something, like the chairmanship of a critical subcommittee investigating the Korean War, he didn't ask, he insinuated. He positioned things so that Russell came to see Johnson's advancement as an extension of his own ambitions, and it worked. After only a year and a half in the Senate, Johnson was named chairman of that subcommittee, a position that gave him national exposure and made him a political force. Russell defended the appointment to skeptics because in his mind it was his idea, but Johnson wasn't finished. He had the conservatives through Russell. Now he needed the liberals, and for that he targeted the most isolated liberal in the Senate, Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota. Humphrey had arrived in the Senate at the same time as Johnson, and he'd been considered the biggest star. Charismatic, passionate, a fiery advocate for civil rights. But Humphrey had made a fatal mistake. In his very first speech, he'd criticized the Senate itself, its slow pace, its clubby atmosphere. The old guard made him pay. His bills went nowhere. When he walked into the cloakroom, senators turned their backs. Some days, driving home from work, Humphrey would pull over to the side of the road and cry. Johnson approached him on a subway ride to the Capitol one afternoon and showered him with praise. "You're brilliant, Hubert. You're articulate. You have the broadest range of knowledge I've ever seen." Humphrey was stunned, and then Johnson hit him with the truth. "But you're spending all your time making speeches and none of it getting anything done. You need to be more pragmatic. You need to fit in." Humphrey became a regular in Johnson's office after that. Johnson poured the drinks, told bawdy stories, taught him the intricacies of Senate procedure, shared everything he'd learned about the psychological weaknesses of various senators, and most importantly, he made Humphrey feel like they were secretly on the same side, two closet liberals who admired Roosevelt, working together to push the country forward. He reintroduced Humphrey to the Southern senators, softened their opinions of him, and got Russell himself to change his mind. Humphrey's isolation ended, his career was reborn, and in exchange, Humphrey became Johnson's bridge to every liberal in the Senate. The influence spread invisibly in every direction, like a gas filling a room. By 1953, just 4 years after being humiliated in Tom Connolly's office, Lyndon Johnson was elected the leader of the Senate Democrats. He was the youngest person to ever hold that position in either party, and within weeks he'd amassed unprecedented power over committee assignments, essentially controlling who sat where and who had influence. The man who had been warned about as a hothead had taken over the entire institution without a single person feeling like they'd been manipulated. Everyone believed they'd acted of their own free will, that their wisdom had been recognized, that helping Johnson was the right and noble thing to do. That is the law of defensiveness in action. Now you might hear this and think, isn't that just manipulation? And the answer is yes, partly. But here's what separates this from cheap tricks. Johnson genuinely listened. He genuinely learned from the people he courted. His empathy was real, even if it was strategic. And the results weren't just good for Johnson. Russell got a more modern staff. Humphrey got his career back. The Democratic Party became more unified. When you confirm someone's self-opinion, you don't just lower their defenses. You create a dynamic where both sides benefit. So how do you apply this in your own life? Start here. The next time you need something from someone, a boss, a client, a partner, resist the urge to lead with your argument. Instead, ask for their advice. People are desperate to share their wisdom, and the act of asking tells them you respect their intelligence. Listen deeply, not performatively, but with genuine curiosity. Mirror their values. Find points of real agreement, and when you do eventually steer toward what you want, frame it so that helping you feels like their idea, their choice, their noble act. Never attack someone's beliefs directly. Never make them feel stupid. Never let them sense that you think you know better. Because the moment you do, the wall goes up, and no argument in the world, no matter how brilliant, will bring it back down. The real power in this life doesn't come from forcing your will on others. It comes from making them want to give you what you need and feel good about it. Law 8. The law of self-sabotage. What if I told you that two people can live in the exact same city, work the exact same job, face the exact same obstacles, and end up with completely opposite lives? Not because one is smarter, not because one got luckier, but because of something invisible, something they carry with them into every room, every conversation, every decision they make. We're talking about attitude, and not in the way your gym teacher meant it, not the poster on the wall that says think positive. We're talking about something far deeper, a lens you developed as a child that now filters everything you see, everything you feel, and everything you believe is possible. And here's the part that most people never understand. That lens doesn't just interpret your reality, it creates it. To show you what this looks like, we need to go to a crumbling wooden house in Taganrog, Russia. The year is 1875, and a 15-year-old boy named Anton Chekhov is about to be abandoned. Anton's childhood had been a study in misery. His father Pavel was a grocery store owner, a religious zealot, and a drunk. Almost every morning, young Anton woke up wondering the same thing. Would he be beaten today, or would he be spared? The beatings came without warning and sometimes without cause. Pavel told his children he was doing it out of love. It was God's will. After the beating, Anton had to kiss his father's hand and ask for forgiveness. When he wasn't being hit, Anton was working. His father would pull him out of his studies and send him to mind the family's grocery shop, a freezing, foul-smelling place where the ink in his pen would freeze in its pot. He'd sit there for hours, listening to the dirty jokes of the workers, watching drunks stumble in for vodka, making sure every single kopeck was accounted for. If even one was missing, he'd get another thrashing. On Sundays, the one day the shop was closed, Pavel would wake the children at 4 in the morning to rehearse hymns for the church choir. By the time the services were over, they were all too exhausted to play. There was no escape from this man's presence, and then one day there was. Pavel had run the grocery store into the ground. The debts piled up, facing bankruptcy and prison. He slipped out of town in the middle of the night without telling his wife. He fled to Moscow, where Anton's 2 older brothers had already moved. The mother was forced to sell everything and follow. The children went with her, all except Anton. He had to stay behind to finish his studies and sell what remained of the family's belongings. At 16 years old, with no money, no family, and no one to turn to, Anton Chekhov was suddenly and completely alone. His first instinct was rage. He blamed his father for everything. He was trapped in this hopeless backwater town, living in the corner of a single room, tutoring other people's children just to eat. Some weeks, when the families he worked for went on vacation, he went hungry for days. His one jacket was threadbare. He had no galoshes for the rain. He felt humiliated every time he entered a student's house, shivering and soaked. But something strange started to happen. As the weeks passed, Anton noticed a shift inside himself. The tutoring work, which he'd expected to hate, actually gave him a sense of pride. He was good at it. He was supporting himself. His father had always told him he was lazy, and he'd believed it. But here he was, running all over town, taking on as many students as he could find, and not just surviving, thriving. He started spending his free hours in the town library, the only quiet place he could work in peace. At first he went for his schoolwork, but soon he wandered into the literature and philosophy sections, and suddenly his mind was soaring far beyond Taganrog. With books, the walls of his tiny world dissolved. At night he would return to his corner of the room and write stories. He had no privacy, but he kept his space neat and organized, a small kingdom of his own. And then came the moment that changed everything. One day, walking through the streets of Taganrog, Chekhov was struck by a sudden and overwhelming wave of empathy. not just for the people around him, but for his parents. It came out of nowhere, and it startled him. For weeks he'd been thinking about his father, not with anger, but with something closer to curiosity. He started to trace the pattern backward. Pavel's father had been born a serf, a form of indentured slavery that had lasted generations. Pavel had an artistic temperament. He could have been a painter or a musician. Instead, he was chained to a grocery store and 6 children. His own father had beaten him, and so he beat his sons. Though he was no longer technically a serf, Pavel still bowed and kissed the hand of every local official who walked past. And in that moment, walking through the grim streets of a town he'd once hated, Chekhov understood. His father wasn't a tyrant. He was a broken man, helpless, trapped by his own history, repeating the only patterns he'd ever known. And Anton could feel himself falling into the same cycle. Bitter, self-pitying, secretly believing he was worthless, taking his anger out on others. He made a vow: no more bowing, no more complaining, no more blaming. The answer to everything was work and love, work and love. He would save himself, and then he would save his family. When he finally moved to Moscow in 1879 to attend medical school, what he found was devastating. His entire family was crammed into a single room in the basement of a tenement in the middle of the red light district. His mother was broken by anxiety. His father drank even more. His younger siblings had dropped out of school and felt completely useless. His brother Alexander had turned to alcohol and blamed everything on their father. The whole family was spiraling. Most people in Chekhov's position would have done one of 2 things: either join the spiral or run from it. He did neither. He moved into that cramped room and became the catalyst for change. Not by preaching, not by lecturing, by example. He announced he was taking over the housework. Seeing their brother cleaning and ironing, the others slowly joined in. He scraped together money from his scholarship and got his father to contribute. He put his younger siblings back in school. He found his father a better job. He moved the family to a larger apartment. Night after night, he got his brothers and sister to read books he had chosen, and they would argue and debate late into the evening. Slowly, the family transformed. The self-pity disappeared. His younger brothers started talking excitedly about their futures. They began calling him Papa Antosha, the leader of the family. Years later, when his growing fame as a writer brought him into contact with the petty jealousies of the literary world, Chekhov felt himself sinking again. His solution was brilliant. He recreated the conditions that had saved him in Taganrog. He abandoned comfort and made himself vulnerable. He traveled across Siberia to Sakhalin Island, the most notorious prison colony in Russia, to interview hundreds of the most hardened criminals and document the conditions. It was grueling and dangerous, and it nearly killed him. But when he returned, his sense of proportion was restored. The petty complaints of his fellow writers seemed laughable compared to what he'd witnessed. And when tuberculosis finally caught up with him, when a doctor told him to retire and spend his remaining years in a sanatorium, he refused. He would live at full intensity until the very end. In his final winter, knowing he was dying, he insisted on taking an open sleigh ride into the country, just to hear the bells and feel the cold air one more time. Now here's the lesson buried inside this story, and it's one of the most important ideas you'll hear today. Nothing about Chekhov's external circumstances changed when his attitude shifted. Taganrog was still grim, the corner of the room was still tiny, his father was still a broken man. What changed was the lens, and the moment that lens shifted, from resentment to empathy, from victimhood to ownership, his entire reality reorganized itself around the new perspective. That is the law of self-sabotage. Your attitude is not a reaction to your circumstances. Your circumstances are, to a remarkable degree, a product of your attitude. Think about this honestly. When something goes wrong in your life, where does your mind go first? Do you look inward at your own choices, your own patterns, your own contribution to the problem, or do you look outward, blaming bad luck, difficult people, unfair systems? If you're being honest, you look outward. We all do. It's the default. But every time you do, you're reinforcing a lens that makes you smaller, more passive, more dependent on things you can't control. Now ask yourself a second question. When was the last time you deliberately chose a harder path? Not because you had to, but because you knew the difficulty itself would change you. Chekhov didn't just survive his circumstances, he used them as raw material for transformation. The abandonment became his education. The loneliness became his laboratory. The suffering became his art. He didn't wait for the world to treat him better. He decided to see the world differently, and the world responded. You can do the same thing, not by pretending everything is fine, not by pasting a smile over real pain, but by recognizing that the single most powerful force shaping your experience of life is the attitude you carry into it every single day. And that attitude, unlike your genes, unlike your childhood, unlike the economy, is something you can actually change. As Chekhov once wrote, describing himself in the third person, the young man squeezed the slave out of himself, drop by drop, until one morning he woke to find that the blood in his veins was no longer the blood of a slave, but that of a real human being. Law 9. The law of repression. Picture someone you know well, a friend, a colleague, a family member, someone who seems put together, confident, pleasant, the kind of person who always says the right thing. Now think about the last time that person surprised you. Maybe it was a cruel comment that came out of nowhere, a sudden burst of anger that didn't match the situation, a decision that made absolutely no sense for someone so supposedly reasonable. In that moment, it was like you were looking at a completely different person, someone you didn't recognize. You weren't imagining it. You were looking at a different person. Or more precisely, you were looking at the part of that person they've spent their entire life trying to hide. To understand this law, we need to go inside the mind of a man who hid more than almost anyone in public life and ultimately destroyed himself because of it. Richard Nixon accomplished what many people consider the greatest comeback in American political history. In 1960, he lost the presidential election to John F. Kennedy. 2 years later, he was crushed in the race for governor of California. The morning after that defeat, bitter and humiliated, he told the press, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore, because this is my last press conference." Time magazine ran a feature called The Political Obituary of Richard Nixon. His career was declared dead, but Nixon had been surviving crises since he was a young man. His family was too poor for the Ivy League education he desperately wanted, so he transformed himself into a superhuman student, earned the nickname Iron Butt, and clawed his way into Duke University Law School on a scholarship. When Eisenhower tried to drop him from the vice presidential ticket over a financial scandal, Nixon went on live television and delivered the speech of his life. He had been counted out again and again, and every time he came back stronger. And so when he won the presidency in 1968, defeating Hubert Humphrey in a tight race, Nixon set out to build something lasting. He wasn't just going to be president, he was going to be a great president. In his private notebooks, he began referring to himself as RN, the initials of a world leader, a man of destiny. RN would be strong, resolute, compassionate. RN would end the Vietnam War, broker peace with the Soviets, open diplomatic relations with China. RN would take his place alongside Abraham Lincoln and Woodrow Wilson in the pantheon of American greatness. And for a while it worked. He signed landmark environmental protections. He created new worker safety standards. He made his historic trip to China. He opened arms negotiations with the Soviet Union. The man who had been politically dead just 6 years earlier was now reshaping the world order. But behind the polished image of RN, something dark was stirring. And it came out at night, late in the evening, after hours of official business. Nixon would sit in his office with a small circle of trusted aides: Bob Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, Charles Colson. The drinks would flow, and Nixon would start talking, not about policy, about his enemies. He would go back decades, reliving old wounds with an intensity that startled even the men who knew him best. The Alger Hiss case, which had made him famous, but earned him the permanent hatred of the East Coast elite. The way those Harvard types looked down on him, the kid from Whittier, California. The way Katharine Graham and the Washington Post had run a vendetta against him for years. The way Bobby Kennedy had played dirtier than Nixon ever had and gotten away with it. The more he talked, the hotter his language became. Jews were disloyal. Liberals were out to get him. Enemies were everywhere, and his team was doing nothing about it. He wanted names. He wanted audits. He wanted to know what the elites at the Georgetown parties were saying about him behind his back. His speechwriter, Ray Price, would later describe two Nixons. The light Nixon was considerate, caring, sentimental, generous of spirit. The dark Nixon was angry, vindictive, ill-tempered, mean-spirited. Price said the two were at constant war with one another. But there's a deeper explanation. And to understand it, you need to understand what was hidden. What Nixon spent his entire life trying to bury. As an infant, Nixon was an unusually needy child. He cried constantly and was almost impossible to soothe. He craved attention and affection, and when he didn't get it, he became manipulative. His parents didn't appreciate this quality. They wanted a stoic, self-reliant child. His father was physically cold and occasionally abusive. His mother was more caring but frequently depressed, and she was forced to leave Richard alone for months at a time to care for two of his brothers who were seriously ill. Both brothers eventually died. What the young Nixon learned from all of this was that vulnerability was dangerous. Neediness was weakness. Sensitivity was a liability. And so he built a shell. He became tough, resilient, fierce, relentless in debate, impossible to intimidate. This was the persona that carried him through every crisis of his career. It was real in the sense that he had genuinely cultivated these qualities, but it was also a mask, constructed to cover the frightened, needy child who had never been loved the way he needed to be loved. That hidden child, with all its insecurities, its craving for approval, its paranoid fear of abandonment, didn't disappear. It sank into what the psychologist Carl Jung called the shadow. And the shadow doesn't stay quiet forever. Under stress, the shadow stirs. It leaks out in ways the conscious mind can't control. And for Nixon, the presidency was the ultimate stress test. The more pressure he faced, anti-war protests, media scrutiny, political opposition, the more the dark Nixon emerged. The late-night ranting sessions, the enemies lists, the obsessive need to know what people really thought of him, the cruelty disguised as toughness. And then Nixon made a decision that in hindsight can only be understood as the shadow taking charge. Early in his presidency, he had installed a secret voice-activated taping system throughout the White House. The official reason was practical. He wanted a record of conversations for his memoirs. But think about this for a moment. Here was a man who was terrified of leaks, who suspected betrayal in everyone around him, who had built his entire identity around control and discipline, and he voluntarily created thousands of hours of recordings in which the mask was completely off. The swearing, the paranoia, the pettiness, the vindictiveness, all of it captured on tape. Why didn't he destroy the tapes the moment they became a liability? He had every opportunity. His chief of staff begged him to do it. The answer is that some part of Nixon, the repressed, denied, shadow self, wanted to be discovered. The child who had been forced to hide for so long was staging a rebellion. The mask had become unbearable, and the shadow was tearing it off. When edited transcripts of the tapes were finally released in 1974, the public was horrified. The language, the casual cruelty, the paranoia, the complete absence of any interest in justice or truth. Even members of Nixon's own family were shocked. This was not the strong, principled RN the nation had elected. This was someone else entirely. Nixon resigned in August of that year. And in his final address to his staff, fighting to control his emotions, he said something that revealed more than he intended. Never get discouraged, he told them. Never be petty. Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them, and then you destroy yourself. He was describing exactly what had happened to him, the hatred he had denied, the bitterness he had buried, the vulnerability he had locked away. It had all risen to the surface and consumed him. The shadow had won. Now, here's why this matters to you. You are not Richard Nixon, but the mechanism operating inside him is operating inside you right now. You have built a persona, a version of yourself that emphasizes your strengths and conceals your weaknesses. You've gotten so good at playing this role that you've forgotten it is a role, and underneath it, there's a part of you that you've been pushing down since childhood. Your insecurities, your selfish impulses, your desire for revenge, your hunger for attention you're embarrassed to admit you want. That repressed self doesn't just sit there quietly. It leaks. It comes out in sudden bursts of anger you can't explain, in decisions that sabotage your own success, in relationships where you keep repeating the same destructive patterns, in offhand comments you make that you instantly regret and then tell yourself you didn't really mean. You did mean them. The shadow was speaking. The solution isn't to fight the shadow or push it deeper underground. Every time you do that, you make it stronger. The solution is to look at it, to acknowledge it, to say, yes, I have a selfish side, an aggressive side, a petty side. I have insecurities I've been hiding for years. I have desires I'm ashamed of. And that's fine. That's human. Because here's the paradox. The people who seem most authentic, the ones you're naturally drawn to, the ones who radiate a kind of easy confidence, are not the ones who've successfully hidden their dark side. They're the ones who've looked at it, accepted it, and integrated it into who they are. They can laugh at their own flaws. They can admit mistakes without collapsing. They don't need to project an image of perfection, because they know perfection is a lie. That's the freedom Nixon never found. And it's available to you the moment you stop pretending you don't have a shadow and start asking what it's trying to tell you. Law 10. The law of envy. Have you ever had a friend turn on you, seemingly out of nowhere? One day everything's fine, you're close, you trust each other, you share everything, and then something shifts. They become cold. They make little comments that get under your skin, not quite insults, but not quite jokes either. They start talking about you behind your back, and when you finally confront them, they act wounded, as if you're the one who's been unfair. You replay the whole thing in your head, trying to figure out what you did wrong, what you said, when the friendship broke, and you come up empty because the answer isn't something you did. The answer is something they felt, something so ugly, so uncomfortable, so deeply human that almost nobody will ever admit to feeling it. Envy. Of all the emotions that govern human behavior, none is trickier to detect, and none is more destructive than envy. And the reason is simple. We will admit to almost anything before we'll admit to being envious. Anger? Sure, someone provoked us. Fear? Understandable. The world is dangerous. Jealousy? Painful, but at least we can name it. But envy? Envy requires us to confess something unbearable, that we feel inferior to someone else, that they have something we want, that we can't get it on our own. No one wants to sit with that feeling. And so almost the instant we feel the first pang, we transform it into something else. Resentment, indignation, moral outrage. We convince ourselves that the person we envy doesn't deserve what they have. They got lucky, they're manipulative, they're not that talented. And once we've rewritten the story in our heads, we feel completely justified in doing something about it. To see how this plays out in its most devastating form, we need to go to Italy. The year is 1821, and a young English woman named Jane Williams is about to walk into the life of one of the most famous writers in Europe, Mary Shelley. You probably know the name. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein at the age of 19, Her mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the first great feminist writers in history. Her father was William Godwin, a celebrated philosopher. She had eloped as a teenager with the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, and the two of them had been living a scandalous, nomadic life across Europe ever since, traveling with Lord Byron, defying every convention of their time, and becoming the subject of endless gossip and fascination. But by 1821, Mary was in a dark place. Two of her young children had died from fevers in Italy. The guilt was crushing. Her marriage was strained. She and Percy had settled in Pisa, hoping to rebuild their lives. And that's when Jane and Edward Williams arrived. Jane came with a romantic backstory. She'd been married to an abusive soldier, had fallen in love with the dashing Edward, and the two of them had run off together, not unlike the Shelleys themselves. They were clearly starstruck when they met Mary and Percy. Jane was pretty, cheerful, and eager to please. Edward seemed to worship Percy and wanted to be a writer himself. At first, Mary didn't think much of Jane. In a letter to her husband, she described Jane as dull, slow in her speech, lacking in depth, fond of arranging flowers and playing the harp and not much else. But Mary was lonely. English expatriates in Italy avoided the Shelleys as if they carried a disease. Jane was there, she was friendly, and she had a new baby, just as Mary had a young son. The two women bonded as mothers in a foreign land. Mary let her guard down. She forgot the warning a mutual friend had written to her. Keep your distance from Jane Williams. Now here's where the invisible machinery begins to turn. Think about what Jane saw when she looked at Mary. A woman who was everything Jane was not. Brilliant, famous, well-connected, married to one of the most celebrated poets alive, a personal friend of Lord Byron, the daughter of intellectual royalty, and on top of all that, a genuinely generous person, warm, caring, willing to help anyone in need. Some people look at someone like that and feel admiration. They're inspired. They want to learn, to grow, to reach for something higher. But for others, for people who feel a deep, unacknowledged sense of inadequacy, that kind of proximity doesn't inspire. It burns. Jane couldn't admit this to herself. She liked Mary. She was flattered by Mary's attention. Being friends with Mary Shelley was exciting, but the more time they spent together, the more the imbalance between them gnawed at her. Mary had the famous husband, the literary talent, the illustrious family name, the friendship with Lord Byron. Jane had what? A pretty face and a pedal harp. And so, almost without realizing it, Jane began to construct a narrative. Mary wasn't really that special. She was moody, difficult, not particularly loving toward her husband. In fact, Percy seemed unhappy in the marriage, and who could blame him? Mary was depressive and clingy. She was nothing like Jane, cheerful, easygoing, adoring. Jane never argued. Jane only looked at Percy with admiration and agreed with everything he said. Percy noticed. He began spending more time with Jane. He bought her a guitar. He wrote poems in her honor. He started comparing the two women, his complicated, melancholy wife and this uncomplicated, agreeable new companion. Jane encouraged every bit of this, subtly widening the crack in the Shelleys' marriage while presenting herself as the innocent bystander. Mary watched it happen. She knew her husband's pattern. He always chased someone different from whoever he was with. But she didn't take Jane seriously as a threat. She was too ordinary. Percy was just poeticizing her. He'd see through it eventually. She was wrong about the depth of the danger, but not in the way she expected. In the summer of 1822, Percy Shelley and Edward Williams set out on a sailing trip along the Italian coast. Mary had begged Percy not to go. She had terrible premonitions. The boat they'd designed was beautiful but flimsy. Percy couldn't swim, but he went anyway. On July 8th, they sailed into a storm. The boat sank. All three men on board drowned. Mary was consumed by guilt. She replayed every argument, every harsh word, every moment she hadn't been the wife Percy deserved. She vowed to spend the rest of her life making his poetry famous. Jane seemed devastated too, but she recovered quickly. She had to. She had no money, no husband, no prospects. She returned to London, and Mary gave her a list of contacts to help her get started, including Percy's oldest friend, a lawyer named Thomas Hogg. And then the poison began to spread. Slowly, Mary noticed that people who had once been warm to her were pulling away. Leigh Hunt, an old family friend who had been in Italy with them, became inexplicably cold. Thomas Hogg, who had known the Shelleys for years, grew distant and chilly in his letters. Other friends seemed to look at Mary differently, as if they were seeing her through someone else's eyes. Mary couldn't understand it. She was grieving. She was alone. This was the moment she needed support most, and the people around her were withdrawing. She wondered if she'd done something wrong. Maybe she wasn't showing enough emotion. Maybe people thought she was cold. The truth was far worse. One afternoon, a young woman named Isabel Robinson, someone Mary had recently befriended and was helping through a personal crisis, sat down with Mary and told her something that made her blood run cold. For months, Jane Williams had been telling anyone who would listen a very specific set of stories about Mary Shelley, that Percy had never truly loved his wife, that he'd been miserable in the marriage, that Mary was cold, unfeeling, and selfish, that Jane herself had been the real love of Percy's life, and, most devastatingly, that Mary's difficult temperament had made Percy so unhappy that on the day he set sail for the last time, he may have secretly wanted to die. Jane Williams was telling people that Mary Shelley had driven her own husband to his death. Mary was shattered, but as the shock subsided, something else took its place: clarity. Suddenly the coldness of Hogg made sense. The distance from Leigh Hunt made sense. The strange looks from friends who had once adored her, all of it made sense. Jane had spent years poisoning the well, and she'd done it so skillfully that no one suspected envy as the motive. They believed her because she seemed so harmless, so sweet, so incapable of malice. Mary confronted her. Jane burst into tears. She denied everything. She turned it around, accusing Mary of being cold and unaffectionate, demanding to know who had betrayed her confidence. It was a masterful performance, but the spell was broken. Mary could finally see the woman behind the mask, not a friend, but a competitor, not a victim, but an operator, someone who had befriended her specifically because the closeness gave her the ammunition she needed to wound. Mary wrote in her journal afterward, "My friend has proved false and treacherous. Have I not been a fool?" Now, you might think this is an extreme case, a centuries-old drama between literary figures that has nothing to do with your life. But think again. Envy doesn't announce itself. It arrives wearing the costume of friendship. The people most likely to envy you are not your enemies. They're the people closest to you, your peers, your colleagues, the friend who seems a little too interested in your successes and a little too quick with a backhanded compliment. Here's a test you can use, borrowed from the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. The next time you suspect someone might harbor envy toward you, share a piece of genuinely good news, a promotion, a new relationship, a financial windfall. Watch their face in the first half second before they compose their response. You'll see a flash of something, a tightening around the eyes, a micro frown, a fraction of a second where their expression doesn't match the congratulations that follow. That flash is the truth. Everything after it is performance. The same test works in reverse. Share some misfortune and watch for a flicker of brightness in their eyes, a momentary spark of pleasure that disappears as quickly as it arrived. The Germans have a word for that pleasure: Schadenfreude, joy in another person's pain, and it is the fingerprint of envy. You cannot eliminate envy from human life. It's wired into us. We are compulsive comparers, but you can protect yourself. Be alert to friendships that form too quickly and feel too intense. Be skeptical of praise that seems excessive or lands at strange moments. Pay attention when someone who claims to care about you consistently gives you advice that doesn't serve your interests. And when you detect the pattern, Don't try to repair the relationship. Distance yourself. The envier will not change because they cannot admit, even to themselves, what's driving them. As for the envy you feel yourself, and you do feel it, even if you'd rather not admit it, the healthiest thing you can do is convert it into fuel. Instead of resenting someone's success, ask yourself, what can I learn from what they did? Instead of wishing you had what they have, ask, what's stopping me from building something of my own? The difference between destructive envy and productive emulation is simple. Envy says they don't deserve it. Emulation says, I'm going to earn it. Law 11. The law of grandiosity. What would you do if you were handed the keys to one of the most beloved entertainment companies on earth and told to make it great again? In 1984, a man named Michael Eisner got that chance. He was named chairman and CEO of the Walt Disney Company, and on paper, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. But the Disney he inherited was barely alive. Since the death of Walt Disney in 1966, the company had been running on fumes. Executives played cards after lunch and spent their afternoons in the company steam room. The film studio produced maybe 3 movies a year, none of them hits. The Burbank lot felt like a ghost town. An actor who worked there described it as a Greyhound bus station from the 1950s. Eisner was the opposite of everything Disney had become. He was restless, competitive, and relentless. He'd risen through the ranks at ABC, invented hit television shows, then jumped to Paramount Pictures and turned it into the hottest studio in Hollywood. He had a formula: keep budgets low, start with a brilliant concept, and let the concept do the marketing. It had worked spectacularly at Paramount, and he was certain it would work at Disney, and at first he was right. Within months of taking over, Eisner restructured the company, brought in his own people, most notably Jeffrey Katzenberg, a brutally efficient executive who became head of the film studio, and started churning out hits. 15 of the first 17 films turned a profit. He discovered the Disney library, hundreds of classic cartoons and animated features sitting on shelves, never released on home video. He put them all out at exactly the right moment, as the home video market was exploding. He opened Disney retail stores. The stock price soared. He revived the old wonderful world of Disney television show and put himself on camera as the host, presenting himself as the spiritual heir to Walt Disney himself. And this is where the story takes a turn that should sound familiar to anyone who's ever watched success go to someone's head, because something was happening inside Michael Eisner that he couldn't see. The attention, the magazine covers, the Wall Street praise, the public adoration was doing something to his brain. It was inflating his estimation of his own abilities far beyond what reality could support. And the more inflated it got, the less he could distinguish between the part of his success that came from talent and hard work and the part that came from luck, timing, and the contributions of the people around him. Think about what had actually happened. When Eisner arrived at Paramount, several hit films were already in production before he got there. His boss, Barry Diller, had challenged and sharpened every one of his ideas. At Disney, he'd inherited a library worth billions and walked into a home video boom he had nothing to do with. Jeffrey Katzenberg was the one in the trenches every day, overseeing the films that were generating most of the revenue. Frank Wells, his president and chief operating officer, was handling the financial complexity that Eisner had no patience for, but none of that fit the narrative Eisner was building in his own mind. In that narrative, he was the genius. He was the turnaround artist. He had the golden touch, and the more people told him so, the more he believed it. The first crack appeared with Euro Disney. Eisner decided to build a new theme park near Paris, not because the economics made sense, but because he wanted to make a cultural statement. He hired the world's best architects. He insisted on pink stone castles with handcrafted stained glass windows instead of the usual fiberglass. He chose Paris over Barcelona despite worse weather Because Paris was grander, he overruled the experienced advisors who urged a more modest, practical approach. When the park opened in 1992, it was a disaster. The French didn't want to wait in long lines, especially in bad weather. No beer or wine was served, which in France was almost an insult. The hotel rooms were overpriced, and despite all the attention to architectural detail, the castles still looked like expensive versions of theme park kitsch. Attendance was half of what Eisner had projected. The debts ballooned. It became the first genuine failure of his career. A healthy mind would have paused here, examined what went wrong, recalibrated. But Grandiosity doesn't allow for that. Admitting the mistake would mean admitting that the golden touch was an illusion. And so Eisner did what grandiose people always do. He blamed someone else. Frank Wells should have caught the financial problems. It was Wells's job, not his. Then came the move that would begin his real unraveling. Jeffrey Katzenberg, the man who had overseen the Disney animation renaissance, who had shepherded Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and The Lion King from concept to screen, began receiving more and more public attention. Magazine profiles credited Katzenberg as the creative genius behind Disney's resurgence. Someone reported to Eisner that Katzenberg had been going around saying he was the Walt Disney of today. Whether or not Katzenberg actually said that, it detonated something inside Eisner. Here was a subordinate getting credit that belonged to him. Katzenberg had written a memo criticizing the studio's drift toward expensive blockbusters, a memo that felt like a veiled attack on Eisner's own pet projects. The suspicion metastasized into hatred, and in August of 1994, Eisner fired Jeffrey Katzenberg. The entertainment world was stunned. Katzenberg was arguably the most successful studio executive in Hollywood. The Lion King alone had generated hundreds of millions in profit, but Eisner didn't care about the business logic. His ego had been threatened, and the ego won. What followed was a cascade of self-inflicted disasters. Eisner engineered Disney's purchase of ABC, a dazzling headline that doubled the size of the company, but created a management nightmare he couldn't handle. He lured his old friend Michael Ovitz, the most powerful talent agent in Hollywood, to become president, then systematically humiliated him. He put Ovitz in a shabby office on the wrong floor. He blocked every deal Ovitz tried to close. He had his lieutenants monitor every penny Ovitz spent. Within 14 months, Ovitz was fired, taking an enormous severance package with him. Katzenberg sued for the bonus he was owed under his contract. Eisner had the chance to settle for $90 million, but refused, certain he owed nothing. A judge ruled against him, and the final settlement was $280 million. The internet portal Eisner launched to compete with Yahoo was a spectacular flop. ABC underperformed. The hit films dried up. Steve Jobs, the CEO of Pixar, publicly announced he would never work with Disney again because he couldn't stand Eisner's micromanaging. One by one, every pillar of the empire Eisner had built began to crack, not from external forces, but from decisions that traced back to a single source. A man who could no longer tell the difference between his inflated self-image and reality. In 2004, the shareholders voted a historic rebuke of his leadership. Roy Disney, Walt's nephew, the man who had originally championed Eisner for the job, organized a revolt called Save Disney. In September of 2005, Eisner resigned. The man who had once been celebrated as the savior of Disney walked away with almost no allies left. Now, here's the uncomfortable part. This story isn't really about Michael Eisner. It's about you. Not on his scale, obviously, but the mechanism is identical. Every one of us carries a deep need to feel important, to feel special, to feel superior to others in some way. That need is wired into us from infancy. When we were very young, we felt omnipotent. We cried, and the world responded. Then we had to confront reality. We were small. We were dependent. We were one person in a very large world, and that realization never quite stopped stinging. So we compensate. We inflate ourselves in small ways, overestimating our skills, underestimating the role of luck, taking credit for things that weren't entirely our doing. Most of the time, this is harmless. A little confidence helps you take on challenges and push past your limits. But the moment success enters the picture, real success, the kind that comes with attention and praise, that low-grade inflation can spike into something dangerous. Ask yourself this. After a recent success, a good review, a promotion, a project that went well, did you stop to honestly assess the role that luck played? Did you think about who helped you? Or did you skip straight to the feeling of, I earned this, I'm that good? The antidote to grandiosity is not false humility. It's not pretending you're not talented or that your success doesn't matter. The antidote is the discipline of honest self-assessment after every victory. Wipe the slate clean with each new project. Start from zero. Remember that the skills that got you here may not be the skills that get you to the next level. Resist the pull of bigger, louder, more, and ask instead, is this the right move, or is this just the move that will get me the most attention? Success is earned in reality. It is lost in fantasy. The moment you stop seeing the world as it is and start seeing it as a mirror reflecting your own greatness, that is the moment the fall begins. Law 12. The law of gender rigidity. What happens to a person who refuses to be put in a box? Not metaphorically, literally refuses. A person who looks at the role the world has assigned them and says, no, I'm more than that. I will be all of the things I actually am, not the narrow slice you've decided is acceptable. We're about to meet someone who did exactly that. Centuries before anyone had the language or the framework to explain why it mattered, and the effect she had on the people around her was so electric, so disorienting, so magnetic, that men who had never met her wrote letters confessing their obsession. Artists used her as a model for their greatest paintings, and the most feared military commander in Italy tried to seduce her on a drawbridge before she nearly trapped him inside her own castle. Her name was Caterina Sforza, and her story begins in a castle library in Milan around 1470. Caterina was born in 1463, the illegitimate daughter of a beautiful Milanese noblewoman and Galeazzo Maria Sforza, who would become the Duke of Milan. Galeazzo did something unusual for the time. He brought his daughter into the family castle, ordered that she be raised alongside his legitimate children, and gave her the finest education available in Europe. His own personal tutor, a renowned humanist, became her tutor. She studied Latin, Greek, philosophy, science, and military history. Most girls in this era were taught needlework and obedience. Caterina was taught sword fighting. She went on hunting expeditions with the family and was trained to kill wild boar and stags. She watched her father ride with terrifying impetuosity, hunt the largest animals without flinching, and command a court of diplomats with effortless authority, and she absorbed every bit of it. But there was another side to her father that she absorbed just as deeply. He was an aesthete. He loved spectacle. Elaborate theater troupes, brightly colored tents, soldiers marching in the family colors of scarlet and white. He wore bejeweled silk gowns and kept up with the latest Milanese fashions. He would cry like a baby listening to choral music. He had an almost limitless appetite for beauty, art, and sensation. Young Caterina internalized all of this. The warrior and the artist, the strategist and the sensualist, the bold commander and the weeping music lover. She didn't see these as contradictions. They were all part of who her father was, and they became part of who she was. At 10 years old, Caterina was married off as a political pawn, a common fate for daughters of powerful families. Her husband was Girolamo Riario, the 30-year-old nephew of the Pope. He turned out to be everything her father was not: moody, self-absorbed, insecure, politically reckless. But Caterina played her role dutifully. She moved to Rome. She became the most fashionable woman at the papal court, ordering elaborate gowns from Milan, never wearing the same outfit twice, setting trends that swept through the city. She charmed the Pope's courtiers with her intelligence and wit. Botticelli used her as a model, and then, in 1484, the Pope died. Suddenly, everything was at stake. Without papal protection, Caterina and her husband were exposed to their enemies. The powerful Colonna family was plotting revenge. A new pope would almost certainly side against them. Girolamo, who was still technically the captain of the papal armies, was paralyzed with fear. He refused to enter Rome. Caterina watched her husband freeze, and something ignited inside her. She later said she could feel her father's spirit inhabiting her body. In the middle of the night, 7 months pregnant, she mounted a horse and rode alone into a city engulfed in chaos. Mobs filled the streets. Nobody recognized the pregnant woman slipping through the darkness. She rode straight to the Castel Sant'Angelo, the most strategic fortress in Rome. Whoever controlled the castle controlled the city. Its cannons could be aimed at every road leading to the Vatican. She identified herself to the lieutenant inside, took command, threw him out, and smuggled in loyal soldiers. Within hours, the cannons of Sant'Angelo were pointed at every route the cardinals needed to use to elect a new pope. Caterina had made it physically impossible for them to gather, and she refused to stand down until they guaranteed that all of her family's lands and titles would be preserved. For 11 days, a single pregnant woman held the city of Rome hostage. When a cardinal's envoy arrived to negotiate and seemed reluctant to meet her terms, she shouted down from the ramparts so that the entire crowd below could hear, "He wants a battle of wits with me. What he doesn't understand is that I have the brains of Duke Gelazzo, and I am as brilliant as he was." The cardinals caved. When the drawbridge was lowered and Caterina walked out, she found an enormous crowd pressing close, Romans from every class, craning to see the woman who had controlled their city. They had taken her for a frivolous young wife addicted to fashion. Now they stared in astonishment at a woman wearing a silk gown, a heavy sword dangling from a man's belt, her pregnancy unmistakable. They had never seen anything like her, and this was only the beginning. A few years later, when her husband was assassinated in their palace, Caterina was taken captive, along with her 6 children. The assassins marched her to the gates of Ravaldino, the castle that dominated the region, and ordered her to tell the commander to surrender. What followed was one of the most extraordinary pieces of psychological theater in Renaissance history. Caterina pretended to be terrified. Her voice breaking with emotion, she begged the commander to give up the fortress. He refused, exactly as she had secretly instructed him to do. For days, she and the commander played an elaborate game, negotiating in code while the assassins grew increasingly confused. Finally, the commander insisted that Caterina enter the castle alone to sign a surrender document. The assassins, feeling they had no choice, let her cross the drawbridge. And at the last moment, just as she disappeared inside, she turned back, sneered, and made a vulgar gesture at her captors. The entire drama had been staged. She had been in control the entire time. When the assassins dragged her 6 children to the castle walls and threatened to kill them before her eyes, she calculated that they were bluffing. They knew the Sforza army was on its way, and killing the children would guarantee a revenge so brutal none of them would survive. She called their bluff. She shouted down from the ramparts, "Do it then, you fools. I am already pregnant with another child, and I have the means to make more." Then she lifted her skirts to make the point unmistakable. 10 days later, the Sforza army arrived. The assassins scattered. Caterina was restored to power. Years later, when the armies of Caesar Borgia surrounded her castle with 12,000 troops, Caterina chose to fight. She fortified the castle so that she could retreat behind successive barricades, dragging the battle out for days. When Borgia rode up on his white horse to flirt and negotiate, she played along, smiled, gave him certain looks, invited him onto the drawbridge, and then tried to raise it beneath him, nearly trapping the most dangerous man in Italy inside her own fortress. When the walls were finally breached, and it came to hand-to-hand combat, the French commander leading the assault stared in amazement as the Countess, wearing an ornamented breastplate over her dress, charged his men from the front line, handling her sword with the skill of a trained soldier. She was captured only because one of her own men grabbed her from behind and sold her out for a bounty. Even then, she refused to sign away her lands. The Borgias threw her in prison for a year and subjected her to relentless torture. She never broke. Now, here is what makes Katerina Sforza's story more than a historical curiosity. Here is what makes it a law of human nature. We would expect that a woman who flouted every gender convention of her era would have been despised, called a witch, shunned. Instead, the opposite happened. She fascinated almost everyone she encountered. Women admired her. Isabella d'Este, one of the most powerful women in Italy, wrote that if men could be criticized for cowardice, at least the valor of Italian women should be praised. Men, soldiers, priests, artists, servants, nobility were obsessed with her. They could talk strategy and statecraft with her as equals, something they couldn't do with the other women in their lives. But more importantly, they sensed something in her that they recognized, something they craved, a freedom they themselves did not possess. Because here's what most people miss about gender roles. They don't only constrain women, they constrain everyone. Men in Katerina's era were expected to be always in control, always tough, always commanding. They couldn't show vulnerability, couldn't express the full range of their emotions, couldn't access the more sensitive and intuitive sides of their own nature. Katerina, who could shift from a silk gown to a suit of armor to a mother's tenderness to a strategist's coldness within the same hour, represented a kind of wholeness they secretly yearned for. And the one time she abandoned that wholeness, the one time she narrowed herself into a single conventional role, it nearly destroyed her. After her first husband's assassination, Katerina fell in love with a younger man named Giacomo Feo. He worshipped her. She was exhausted from years of constant pressure, and the adoration was intoxicating. She handed over governing power to him. She stopped appearing in public. She shrank herself into the role of the devoted wife. Giacomo was insecure and incompetent. Courtiers warned her. Her own sons warned her. She didn't listen. And when Giacomo was assassinated in front of her eyes, she fell into a depression so severe she considered suicide. It wasn't the loss of Giacomo that devastated her most. It was the realization that she had betrayed herself. She had given up the very qualities that made her powerful, her range, her multiplicity, her refusal to be defined by a single role. She never made that mistake again. So what does Katerina Sforza have to do with your life? More than you might think. Because the same force that boxed in Renaissance women and Renaissance men is operating on you right now. You may not be expected to play the dutiful wife or the stoic warrior, but you are expected to play something. You've been shaped since childhood to present a consistent identity to the world. Boys are told to toughen up, stop crying, be independent. Girls are told to be nice, be agreeable, put other people's feelings before their own. And as we get older, these expectations harden into walls. We lose the parts of ourselves that don't fit the role. The boy who is naturally empathetic becomes the man who can't access his own emotions. The girl who is naturally bold becomes the woman who defers to everyone in the room. Think about this. When was the last time you did something that genuinely surprised the people who know you best? Not because you were being reckless, but because you were expressing a side of yourself that you normally keep hidden. The most magnetic people you've ever met, the ones who seem effortlessly authentic, who radiate a kind of easy confidence, are not performing a perfect version of masculinity or femininity. They're doing the opposite. They've reconnected with the parts of themselves they were taught to suppress. They can be tough and tender, analytical and intuitive, ambitious and empathetic. They don't need other people to complete them because they found the missing pieces inside themselves. That is the law of gender rigidity. The roles you were given are not who you are. They are a costume someone else designed for you. And every day you spend wearing a costume that doesn't fit is a day you spend shrinking away from the full, complicated, contradictory, magnificent person you were born to be. Take the costume off. You'll be amazed at who's underneath. Key takeaways. We've covered 6 laws today, and each one reveals a different invisible force shaping your life. Let me bring them together. Law 7, the law of defensiveness, taught us that influence is not won by the strength of your argument. It is won by how you make the other person feel. Lyndon Johnson didn't rise to power by being the smartest man in the Senate. He rose by being the man who made every other senator feel like the smartest man in the room. When you confirm someone's self-opinion, when you validate their intelligence, their autonomy, and their sense of goodness, their defenses dissolve, and through that opening, you can move them anywhere you need them to go. The lesson is counterintuitive but absolute. Put the spotlight on others, and the power flows to you. Law 8, the law of self-sabotage, taught us that your attitude is not a passive reaction to your circumstances. It is an active force that creates them. Chekhov didn't escape his miserable childhood by changing his environment. He escaped it by changing the lens through which he saw the world. The moment he stopped seeing himself as a victim and started seeing himself as someone with the power to choose work over complaint, empathy over resentment, action over passivity, his entire reality reorganized itself. You carry this same power, not to ignore real suffering, but to refuse to let suffering define the boundaries of your life. Law 9, the law of repression, taught us that the carefully constructed version of yourself you present to the world is not the whole story. Behind the mask lives a shadow, assembled from every impulse you were taught to suppress. Every emotion you learned was unacceptable. Every part of your nature that didn't fit the approved version. Nixon's shadow destroyed the most powerful man on earth. It didn't have to. If he had been willing to look at it, to acknowledge his insecurities, his need for approval, his vindictive streak, he could have controlled it. Instead, he denied it, and it consumed him. The lesson is not to eliminate the shadow. You can't. The lesson is to see it, accept it, and channel its energy into something productive, instead of letting it detonate when you're least prepared. Law 10, the law of envy, taught us that the most dangerous attacks often come from the people closest to us, disguised as friendship. Jane Williams didn't hate Mary Shelley. She admired her, but admiration curdled by a sense of personal inadequacy becomes envy, and envy is the one emotion human beings will never admit to feeling. Learn to read the signs. The flash of displeasure when you share good news, the compliment that somehow makes you feel worse, the advice from a friend that doesn't serve your interests. And protect yourself not through paranoia, but through honest awareness. The envy you feel yourself can be transformed into motivation. The envy others feel toward you can be deflected through humility and distance. Law 11, the law of grandiosity, taught us that success is a drug, and like all drugs, it distorts your perception of reality. Eisner was not a fool. He was brilliant, but the brilliance was swallowed by the myth he built around himself. The myth that he alone was responsible for everything good that had happened, that his skills were infinitely transferable, that he deserved not just respect but adoration. Every success you have will pull you in this direction. Your job is to resist, not by denying your talent, but by staying relentlessly honest about the gap between what you've achieved and what you've been given. Wipe the slate clean after every victory. Start from zero. Earn it again. And Law 12, the law of gender rigidity, taught us that the roles we perform are not who we are. Katerina Sforza was dangerous not because she was masculine or feminine, but because she was both and everything in between. She could shift from a silk gown to a sword, from tenderness to ruthlessness, from seduction to strategy, because she had never amputated the parts of herself that didn't fit someone else's definition of what she should be. You have done this amputation, we all have, and the parts you cut away didn't disappear. They're waiting for you to reclaim them. The more of yourself you can bring to the surface, the more authentic you become. And authenticity is the rarest and most magnetic quality a human being can possess. 6 laws, 6 forces, all of them operating beneath the surface of every relationship, every career, every decision you make. You didn't choose these forces, but now that you can see them, you can choose what to do about them. Let me take you back to where we started. You're sitting across from someone. You have the better argument. The facts are on your side, and they won't budge. Now you know why. Not because they're stubborn, not because they're stupid, but because something deeper is at work. Something ancient, automatic, and invisible. A need to feel autonomous, a need to feel intelligent, a need to feel good, a shadow lurking beneath the surface, an attitude that filters everything they see, an envy they'll never admit, a grandiosity that blinds them to their own limits, a role they've been performing so long they've forgotten it's a performance. And here's the part that changes everything. Every single one of those forces is operating inside you too. The real power in this life doesn't come from mastering other people. It comes from mastering yourself, your defensiveness, your attitude, your shadow, your envy, your ego, and the roles you've been hiding behind. That mastery doesn't make you cold or calculated. It makes you free. So let me leave you with a question, and I want you to actually sit with it, not just hear it. Which of the 6 forces we talked about today is most active in your life right now? And what would change if you stopped pretending it wasn't there? If this book has resonated with you, I'd recommend picking up a copy. I'll leave a link in the description. Whether you prefer the physical book or the audiobook, it's one of those reads that rewards you more the deeper you go. But we're not done yet. There are 6 more laws still to come. Laws about authority, about purpose, about the dark patterns of conformity, about what happens when entire groups lose their minds. That's part 3, and it's on the channel now. If you found value in this, subscribe so you don't miss it, and drop a comment below. I'd love to know which of these 6 laws hit closest to home. I'll see you in the next one.